You're listening to Speed Reading, 20 Years of Sonic the Comic. Sonic the Comic is 20 years old. From humble beginnings to a following in the thousands, Sonic the Comic touched the lives of kids of all ages, with its ongoing adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, his friends and his enemies, as well as all manner of Sega superstars. Join us on this look back on 20 years of Hedgehog history, as STC fans, new and old, recount what it is about this classic comic that keeps them coming back for more, and maybe catch a glimpse of what lies ahead for STC. Sonic the Comic has had over 260 issues, including its regular issues, special issues, and poster magazines. But every issue is somebody's first. Which issue was the first issue of Sonic the Comic you read?
First issue? Well, issue 1 of course. I can't remember where exactly I got that little preview comic from, but I remember reading that and thinking, I've got to get this. So, even though I don't have a complete collection, I was there from day one.
My first issue is number 6. Then I missed a few and got number 9, and then I missed loads and got number 26, and after that I barely missed any, and I'm proud to say I now own every single issue of Sonic the Comic and all the related publications.
My first copy of STC at the time of print was issue 21, but I was lucky enough to get back issues all the way back to 7 or 8, whenever Origin of Sonic was printed. I was 7 years old when I first got into Sonic fandom, like the games and cartoons and stuff, but I didn't get into STC until I was 9. For some reason, I already knew about Amy. I recognised her on the cover of 21. She was being grabbed by a giant blue trooper. I don't think blue troopers are ever actually featured in the comic itself, but never mind. I was instantly hooked. But at the time I was also really surprised at this new world that Sonic was in, and more to the point, his new personality that he has in STC. I was used to the cartoon's chirpy, wisecracking hero with a penchant for chili dogs, running at max speed of course, and soaring through stuff, occasionally dressing up as things. But this Sonic spent a lot of time standing about in cool poses, pointing at things with a hefty scowl, and throwing snarky humour and insults at people. And he does it in 21. He saves a kid from the deadly weapon X, which fires massive pointy objects at people. And in the process he says, "Didn't your mum tell you not to play with sharp objects?" or something like that. And it's very snarky, and I was quite surprised. Reading on, I was also taken aback to see Kinterbor. I mean, to an STC noob, who is this guy? There's no explanation given as to who he is in 21, it's just that his name is Robotnik backwards. I mean, I know who he is now, obviously, but at the time I was like, who's this guy? But yeah, he tells Sonic where Amy has been taken, and that's all very cool. But the next bit that surprised me was that it was Johnny Lightfoot who went with Sonic to rescue her and not Tails. Again, I was used to Tails being Sonic's little bro and going everywhere with him and occasionally being the hero, sometimes at least in the Adventures cartoon. So yeah, that was surprising. Tails was right there, but he doesn't really say anything either, I think, in 21. The idea of the Star Post being used to travel to the Special Zone was appealing though, because it was from the game. And the idea that Robotnik ruled Mobius from there made him seem like this almost untouchable villain, and that was a great idea, I thought, to have him separate from Mobius. Of course, the artwork blew me away. It was like nothing I'd seen before. Even as a small child, I remember being like in awe of Richard Elson's work. And one of the panels that will always stick in my mind is Sonic blasting through the door to Robotnik's base in a move very similar to the triple spin that he uses in the cartoons, only for them in the next panel to be captured by some kind of pink goo. I thought that was pretty funny. Like, there's all this action, rah, yeah, this is going to be easy, yeah, and then they're caught in pink goo. It's great. But with the art, there's just so much detail. I mean, even in the background, everything is so bright and vibrant. I mean, not just in the special zone. It's just fantastic, and it was like no other version of Sonic I'd ever seen, and I think that's what got me hooked.
Some of my earliest issues were actually from a yearbook, which was like a compilation from some of STC's earliest stuff, which just happened to be some of the early stuff from Rich Ellison. And it kind of featured the origin of Sonic and went all the way through to Megatox, which really kind of gave me a really great foundation to kind of start the comic on. And I've been lucky to just really carry on reading the comics since then, all the way up to working on it myself.
My very earliest memory of the comic is it teaching me the difference between Overtake and Takeover from the Knuckles story of the same name. So I think it would be around the 120s, 130s. And I'm one of the few that didn't actually know about the reprints because I thought they were all new stories. I didn't even clock that Richard Ellison was the same artist in his later work as he was in his earlier work when it was reprinted.
The first issue that I ever read, this was supposed to be issue 1, but due to a mix-up when I sent away for a copy in the post, it ended up being issue 2, which the company were nice enough to send out as a replacement. It was probably the first time that they ever actually wanted to read something other than the books that we had in school at the time. And while the Sonic story for the issue wasn't particularly that great, I still enjoyed it, along with the other content that was featured inside.
First issue was technically both issues 1 and 2 at the same time. I was in a classroom at school on a very apparently rainy day in June, and one of the other kids had brought in his copies of the first 2 issues, and that was basically, it wasn't quite my first encounter with a comic, it was the first encounter with a kind of superhero action type of comic, and it all kind of kicked off from there really. But my first port of call that weekend was to go to W.H. Smith's and get myself copies of the first 2 issues, and that was where I discovered that when the second issue of a comic comes out, the first issue goes as well. So I'm able to get a copy of the second issue. However, I did manage to get hold of the first issue a couple of years later, after one of the UCACs, UKCAC comic convention, where I happened to meet the delightful Audrey Wong, who is the assistant editor, of course, and she actually later on that week mailed me a copy of issue 1 with a delightful letter from Megadroid, telling me that, of course, he'd heard that I was there, and he was, of course, in disguise the whole time.
Straight out of the Sega video games, the 5 main characters of Sonic the Comic's stories are a quartet of heroic mammals and a mad scientist, waging a constant battle of good versus evil. Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Amy, and Dr. Robotnik are the most important characters in the ongoing STC plot. But which one do you like best?
Favourite main character, they all have their own ups and downs. I gotta say, of those 5, probably gotta be Dr. Robotnik. Just because he was such a rich and meaty character, and he developed and he evolved so much through the run of the thing, and was always sort of in opposition to wherever Sonic was at the time, and he just became such an interesting, even more interesting dictator archetype than even Doctor Doom. So I couldn't really say any of the other characters, although they all had their interesting journeys themselves.
My favourite main character. At one time this would have been originally Sonic, seeing that he is the main lead role and protagonist of the comic series, but the way he was written at times, coming off as rather dickish to his comrades, really made him look too self-absorbed and full of himself. So my favourite changed to Tails, as he seemed to show keen interest in wanting to actually help out people without being so modest about it, even if he was seen as second banana in many people's eyes.
My favourite main character, it's either Sonic or Knuckles, I cannot decide. I love Sonic's design in all his forms, I think it is a masterful design, and I think it has played a large part in carrying the franchise through some of its darker moments. But I feel that Sonic the Comic is the only time I've really felt for his personality as well. I also really like Knuckles. I like that he isn't gullible or quick to temper in this, he is fairly calm and collected. Also, I really like his mythos, and I really like his design, and I really like the idea of floating islands, which, it's funny, there's a lot of stuff to do with floating islands that I absolutely adored in what I thought was disconnected media, and then last year I finally saw Laputa, A Castle in the Sky, and I just saw how much that movie has influenced things that I love, STC being one of them.
In terms of my favourite main character from the comic, I always liked Knuckles. I always preferred Knuckles over Sonic. He was always just the kind of person that I more identified with. I liked his backstory, the idea that he was the last of his kind. I always liked the mystery about him, and I'm glad that even in the years that followed, no one really tried to answer that question. It always left that mystery, which I always found really, really appealing. He was just a really cool character, and I always felt that his personality in the comic really seems to match my idea of how Knuckles should have acted, at least in the early Mega Drive games, so I thought that was really, really cool.
STC's Amy Rose has always been my favourite interpretation of that character. Even though as a child, when I was reading STC at the first time, I noticed that she was being written differently. She was handled by different writers in different ways. I was more a fan of her earlier appearances, even though design-wise she was wearing that classic green blouse and red skirt rather than the more instantly recognisable as STC Amy, the cargo pants and the amusing t-shirt combo. Her gradual change from the squealing damsel in distress in Girl Trouble and the Sonic Terminator to the ass-kicking action girl during Project Brutus, running wild, and from then on is entertaining, and it's quite good character development, I think, for a relatively, at the time, minor character. She's able to make a deal with Captain Plunder and the Sky Pirates. She later fights against them herself. Watch yourself, Porker. And she quickly becomes an important member of the gang up until about the issue 100 mark. She's actually pretty much the de facto leader while Sonic is stuck in a special zone. However, she never really steals the limelight, especially in the earlier issues. And Amy even says so herself after defeating Plasma that it's important that Mobius sees Sonic as the hero, and not her. So some people might think that's like a character weakness, but I think that's an important part of STC's Amy, and that she's distinct from the others in that she doesn't praise Sonic. She's not on his every word. She has her own power, as it were, but doesn't make a big deal out of it. Another interesting point of STC's Amy is that she only seems to flirt with Sonic to annoy him, which, is pretty funny. And her actual feelings are largely unspoken, and that it remains that way for the entirety of STC's print, and I kind of like that it's not a big thing. In some ways, though, I would like to have seen how her supposed relationship with Johnny Lightfoot would have developed, just to see what effect this would have on her behaviour, maybe towards Sonic, whether she would continue to flirt with him to annoy him, and things like that. But in other ways, I'm very glad that STC always stayed clear from the character's personal feelings, at least in that department. I also always liked that STC Amy's weapons of choice were the crossbow, the longbow with the string, or on one occasion she steals a trooper's gun and fires it at Brutus. That was great, and that it's her shooting skills that her way of fighting, and it makes her distinct again from Sega's version and Archie's version, which have the hammer. I mean, I understand that from Sonic the Fighters onwards, Amy's seen with the hammer, but for me, Amy as a sharpshooter in STC is much better, my personal. As a child, I did want to see more of her, because especially in her earlier appearances, she is quite a background character. She's not, apart from in the Sonic Terminator, really, she's not a big character until later on. And I was very happy when she got her own story in the summer bumper issue. But her later adventures with Techno, and the Eternity Ring in particular, saw her change again into a much more sassier, smart-talking character, and by this point I was no longer really an STC collector for every issue, so my childhood memories of Amy are still through rose-tinted glasses, as it were, unblemished by her not-so-secret past.
Well, I mean, it's got to be Sonic, hasn't it? Aside from him being the hero of the piece, he's so easy to relate to. He's sarcastic, arrogant, overconfident, pig-headed, stubborn, rude, cheeky, and has an appallingly cruel sense of humour. But he's still somehow pretty endearing with it, because he's so cool. Sonic being written as a flawed hero made the character so much more interesting and deep than in any other portrayal of him at the time, and even most versions of him now can't hold a candle to his STC self.
One of the joys about reading STC for me was the way the main characters in particular were written. They were given sort of new and unique personalities independent of the games and the cartoons and other media, so it always proved to be an interesting take. Of the main characters, I'd say my favourite would be Knuckles. Knuckles in STC for me, he always had this sort of air of mystery about him. I suppose that's the only way you can describe it really. This whole thing of him being the last of his kind, as far as he's aware, as well as his whole general sort of demeanour in the STC series. I mean, he's generally treated as a sort of comic relief character in the games and most of the cartoon series, but STC took him quite a lot more seriously than that, and I do applaud them for the way they wrote the character. The introduction of Dr. Zachary, the introduction of that character, the white half cybernetic echidna, that sort of added to the whole sort of mystery of are there more of his kind? Does this new character know whether or not there are? And how could Knuckles ever possibly find out? So there's that whole ongoing sort of story arc that was carried out all the way through STC and also into STCO. There's also the introduction of Tikal and Pachacamac and all the other echidnas from the ancient past, which was carried out sort of towards the end of the original stories in STC, but is being carried on into STCO to really great effect. So I applaud the current writers as well on keeping up Knuckles' current characterization. It's been really enjoyable reading the stories, very intriguing.
Favourite main character? This is a tricky one, as I like what Sonic the Comic did with those characters, especially in comparison to their Sega and Archie counterparts. If I had to choose though, I'd choose Knuckles. First of all, I've always really liked his design, especially this STC incarnation with that silver medallion. I'd like to know the story behind that, and it adds an extra element of mystique to his character. I also tend to identify with him. A bit guarded, finds it hard to trust others, and probably not the most social or easiest guy to get on with. I also like how he interacts with the rest of the main cast. I mean, I really enjoyed the dynamic between him and Tails in that Nameless Zone story they were both in. And it's also great how his friendship with Porker has been developed over time.
Sonic the Comic introduced many great characters. Over the years, many members of STC's secondary cast have joined the fight against Dr. Robotnik, with some being truly worthy entries to the Sonic pantheon. Which heroic or neutral character do you guys like best?
Without a hint of a doubt, my favourite non-main STC character would have to be Techno. Techno, as her name suggested, was a technological genius and wizard computers and all that. I suppose a little like Porker Lewis in a way. He was also sort of techie guy, although the difference between Porker and Techno is that Techno actually did things, actually went out and had all these adventures, and I really enjoyed the way the character was developed all the way through the series. She just had so many layers, so many more than other characters I found in the STC series. But all the way through, I always felt she had this undercurrent of perhaps not being entirely a good character per se, having this suppressed darkness about her, which wasn't really explored for quite a long time. I mean, if you think back to her very first appearance, she was originally helping Dr. Robotnik as one of his assistants, so she was technically a villain to begin with, although she did very swiftly turn on him and become a force for good for the rest of the original STC series. And it's not until a very recent story arc, relatively recent, in Sonic the Comic Online, where that darkness was finally explored and that layer of characterization was finally touched upon. And I found it to be really a rather incredible story. I mean, it was highly controversial, and I understand that not a lot of people enjoyed it at the time, thinking perhaps that they took her a bit too far from her original characterization. Some even going as far as to say they ruined the character, but I think quite the contrary, far from it. I believe it's really added a new perspective on Techno that, well, let's just say I'm really intrigued as to what's going to happen with her next. I'm really looking forward to it.
So many to choose from, and there were a few I like for different reasons. I love the chaotics and the dynamic between them as this highly dysfunctional group that somehow has to work together. It's a ton of fun to watch. In Sonic the Comic Online, there's also Big the Cat, whose every appearance so far has been solid gold. Terrific comedic stuff. Again though, I think the one I sympathise most with is Porker Lewis. To my mind, he's probably the one who acts more like an actual person would. He's timid and unsure of himself, and after his experiences while captured by the Brotherhood of Metallics, he has a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a very believable reaction to that kind of thing. In the end though, he always finds the courage to pull through for his friends, which is a very admirable character trait, and probably why he's my favourite of the supporting cast.
Short Fuse the Cyberneck. Aside from my young self being able to easily relate to a guy who has one heck of a temper on him, the character itself always fascinated me, the most deadly weapon Robotnik had ever created, and the one guy who could defeat Sonic with barely any effort, and he ends up fighting the guy who created him. Shorty's time on the Freedom Fighters team was also one of my favourite minor plotlines, and it served to highlight just how different he is to the other characters in his methodology and behaviour.
The other characters, I think, Porg had the most interesting journey. Certainly having a nervous breakdown was a bit of a revelation to my tiny little 11-year-old mind. I kind of love Arthur. It's pretty obscure. I mean, he appeared in about 5 panels. He struck quite an impression on me as a classic kind of Till Death sort of character from the Kitchen Library. I liked, in her first appearance, I really liked Techno a lot. She struck me more kind of ambiguous kind of character, which she, just lost with each subsequent appearance. But and that's the direction I asked Mike to go in for. Better or worse with his strip. In terms of SEC Online, I really like Officer Bodger. I think that's just it's a character that kind of came out of nowhere, but it's just sort of struck a chord, and I think pretty much every writer's used him, and he's just so funny. I kind of hope someone picks Cream the Rabbit. She's just so kind of fun to write.
This selection goes out to Johnny Lightfoot, a headstrong and quite nimble character to the team. I enjoyed Johnny as being someone who grew into the role more confident and willing to fight instead of just being a background character who showed up every now and then. Even before he was killed off towards the end of the original comic publication, he still came over as wanting to do his best as he possibly could for the team, even if it meant risking his life, and in this particular case he did, in all the name of freedom.
My favourite non-Sonic characters from Sonic the Comic has to be Techno and Shorty, because I loved the Cyberneck design as a kid, and Techno, I kind of identified more with her than I did with Amy, because she's more of a mechanical kind of girl, because Amy I think at the time was still kind of a bit the love-struck kind of archetype, but Techno was just kind of completely asexual in a way. I don't know how to describe her. Basically, she's another female character that, didn't really... that I could kind of latch on to.
My favourite non-main character is probably Captain Plunder. He's the first one I usually go to because I think he has an absolutely perfect chemistry with Filch and Simpson. I think that was done absolutely perfectly throughout the comic, making him just... He got consistently more ridiculous as the comic went on, and I don't think that's a bad direction for him.
But this one was a bit more tricky. But if anyone knows me well on the internetosphere, and they've seen the avatar that I've been using for a long time, they'd probably know that Ebony is one of my favourite neutral characters. And I say neutral for a good reason, because while in her first appearance she helped Knuckles to get out of a sticky situation, her post-RBR decisions to help Supersonic and to deliberately hide him from the Freedom Fighters makes her seem, at least to me, less aligned to the hero's side. This is highlighted even more in STCO because she wipes Dekal's memory, thus preventing Knuckles from learning about his people. And although she does it for Dekal's benefit, Knuckles is not happy about it, and she just seems to kind of stride off. She doesn't seem to really care or want to address the issue. And more recently in STCO, she's revealed her quest to reincarnate Supersonic from Sonic himself. Again, apparently not caring what happens to Sonic, if he disappears in the process if and when she uses this essence that she has. She's more concerned about pacifist Supersonic than she is about Sonic himself. So while fundamentally she's probably a good person and she's doing what she thinks is the right thing, she seems to thoroughly believe that Super was a pacifist, and it was the chaos energy that corrupted him. She seems to put her own agenda above that of Mobius as a whole and that of the Freedom Fighters, so I'd say she's much more aligned towards Super than them, so neutral maybe. From a design perspective, I like Ebony because, well, first of all, she's a black kitty, and I like black kitties. And as a magical cat, she predates Blaze by a number of years, so STC got in there before Sega did. Yeah. Although she's an all-round magic type person, not a pyro mage like Blaze is. Also, she has the ability to magically remove shoes from people's feet, and that's gotta be the best power ever, right? Yeah. Another thing is that her attire, although it might have looked quite normal in her first home in the forests, in the Metropolis zone, she kind of looks like she's attending a Dungeons and Dragons convention, and when she's put next to the floppy, fluffy pyjamas, who wears the great big sweatshirts and has the big fluffy quiff, and then swirly-eyed pacifist Supersonic with his mohawk spikes, they do look quite amusing together. And I also like how, even now in STC, Ebony still resembles other cats from STC's design point of view. Like, she looks like Cam and Fleabite, rather than looking like Sega's Big and Blaze.
My favourite secondary character right now has really got to be Big the Cat. I love the way that Shay's written him over the last couple of issues. He has just been so funny. I love him to bits. Shay really kind of gets the character, and the way that Adamus has been drawing him recently, I can't wait to see more of him.
While Dr. Robotnik is the supreme villain of Sonic's world, Sonic the Comic introduced or reinvented many great villains over the years and continues to do so even now. Which of STC's villains other than Robotnik most sent a chill down your spine? With his intimidating, bordering on terrifying design and intriguing character arc, Commander Brutus is my pick for the best STC villain after Robotnik. Not only is he made from the same nigh indestructible armour as Shortfuse, but he's also programmed with Robotnik's brainwaves, including his drive and ambition. The culmination of Brutus' story, where he rose up against Robotnik and managed to not only be a serious threat to the heroes, but also to the lead villain, was one of the finest stories Lou Stringer ever contributed to STC.
You know, there's been so many extraordinary villains in STC over the years that it's really difficult to choose any particular one, so I'm going to name a few that I like. To start with, I've always liked Grand Chief Whip. I've always found him to be a funny character, purely because he's supposed to be making himself out to be this big, sinister cult leader, and he keeps surrounding himself with idiots, basically. Lutz Sandbolt was another particular favourite of mine, especially when he was in his sort of head, you know them RC robot cars. He sort of represented a really hoppin' mad version of one of them, and I always found that quite funny. From the same storyline, I also liked Tess Tube, even though she never really got to do very much. Bit of a lament of mine that she never did. She had this whole sort of combat-ready action girl persona, which could have been built upon quite well had they developed her. Another one-shot character I liked, who wasn't a villain per se, but I quite enjoyed him anyway. A character called Clark Bent appears in a storyline where he was the news reporter of a place called Small Zone, which was this really dull, boring place where nothing ever happened. And the storyline went that he was just so sick of reporting on non-events that he decided to try and liven things up by filming model representation of Small Zone being rampaged by a toy dinosaur, which of course caused uproar and panic before Tails and the other citizens eventually realised that they hadn't seen this giant lizard rampaging about anywhere, nor could they hear it. So he was eventually rumbled, arrested by a very sort of Soviet-looking police officer, and we've never heard from him since. He's actually still banged up in there today, some 15, 16 years on, for a really very trivial misdemeanour in comparison to many of the other big villains and supervillains. Finally, you can't really leave this question without mentioning Grimer, can you? The most prolific villain in the STC series, barring Robotnik of course. Served for a long time as a sort of underling to the Doctor, but when left to his own devices, he really comes into his own. He's a diabolical genius, masterminds whole operations behind the scenes, as we've seen before in STC, and of course more recently in STCO, where he very successfully ruined Sonic's reputation, just before escaping to another dimension, where he's now, I don't know, living a life of luxury, perhaps, sitting in front of the telly with a cup of tea, watching Pointless or something, starting up a new business perhaps, in order to become the diabolical mastermind of a new dimension and achieve total global domination and such like. But I digress. Grimer is, he's tops. He's the only one and the very best. Bring back Grimer.
I don't think I have a particular favourite, but I do kind of miss Cam and Bert, because I like their dynamic, the fact that these two guys kind of run around and repair badniks. I don't know, I'd like to see more of them in the near future though. I didn't get to read much of them the first time around, so hopefully I'll just kind of go back and find out which issues they appeared in.
Favourite non-Robotnik villain character? Again, I've got to narrow this down to a few choices. I like Grimer because something about his unwavering loyalty to Robotnik helps to humanise the main villain a bit more. I also like Dr. Zachary, mostly from a design perspective, but I liked how he was expanded in Sonic the Comic Online to be shown to be able to attack someone both mentally and physically, and I feel there are still stories that can be told with that character. In the end though, it just has to be Super Sonic though, doesn't it? I love the Jekyll and Hyde angle that they went with in STC. While Super's quite a shallow villain at the end of the day, it was in how his appearances were used sparingly and how they were executed that made him so memorable. I know for certain that I can't take my eyes away whenever he's involved in his story, just to see what kind of destructive insanity he'll conjure up next.
This again was quite tricky because while I do like evil Super Sonic a lot, I mean what kind of boomer doesn't, I feel talking about him is way too obvious. So I wanted to talk about someone else. And I would say probably Badnik Army Repair Functionaries were my favourite non-Robotnik villains. Most because it was nice to see kind of the other side of the ruled by Robotnik era, because they're animals who were for some reason willing to collaborate. Cam and Bert don't seem afraid of Robotnik at all. They actually revere him. They call him the Great Robotnik and stuff like that. And I think in the second story, Cam even says that Sonic destroys everything he touches. So they do seem to be Mobians genuinely choosing to align with the bad guys, which is interesting. I also quite like the characters themselves, and their dynamic. They're quite, not opposites, but they're not complementary characters. Cam is cold and calculating and is quite vicious. She really wants to get the plans to work, but Bert is kind of beefy and brainless and loves his number one hammer, and it's kind of cute. And I also like that their own harebrained schemes, all based around fixing badniks, of course. They're just so... In a way, they're both smart and stupid at the same time. For example, the Seven, they just basically just put a load of parts together to make these mutant-looking badniks, and they're actually quite efficient, I seem to remember. But, yeah. I have to nitpick, of course, though. I mean, like, first of all, the name, Badnik Army Repair Functionaries, obviously spells bath, and it's obviously a joke. I mean, did kids in the 90s say bath, or did we say puke? I don't remember. But anyway, but their names, Cam and Bert, it took me a while to get the joke. Although, cause, yeah, I was a kid. But I don't see how it ties in with the word bath. I mean, I kind of like stinky cheese. Yeah. Another problem I had was that Cam's design in her first appearance is kind of terrifying. She looks a bit like Metamorphia, but her eyes aren't the same, but they both have this massive jaw full of pointy teeth and bleh. But by her second appearance, her design is much more improved, but she still has these massive lumps on her chest and backside. Yeah, Cam's got a very bizarre design. Bert just looks like a massive ox, because I assume that's what he is. I think I would have liked to have seen more of their creations, such as the seven Badniks. Because obviously, while their designs is not as good as Robotnik's were, they're interesting to say the least. I mean, Chop Alien, for example, is my favourite. It's an obvious reference, but it's still quite funny. And in STCO, it would be nice to see what became of Barth without their glorious leader. Perhaps Grimer had something planned for them, I don't know. I wouldn't like to speculate.
Favourite villain character? I'd be letting my teenage self down if I didn't pick Dr. Zachary, and the reason for that is that he was my favourite villain when I was a kid, and in fact when I first came onto the internet, Dr. Zachary was my pseudonym for various reasons. I remember being shown the pages by Nigel Dobbin at the UCAC I mentioned earlier. I loved. I just loved the whole idea of this. He was almost a doppelganger for Knuckles, but he had this kind of secret, and you wanted to know what that secret was. Never really found out, but I love the evolution as well, with the whole cyborg element. It was just brilliant. Also loved Zorobel. She had this badass pirate gang. And they were all afraid of this little old lady in a wheelchair who put them in their place every single time. Of course, the common denominator between these two characters is Nigel Dobbin, because he did the best villain designs. They always look completely out of place from everything else because everything else he draws is just so beautiful.
My favourite villains from Sonic the Comic have always been the Brotherhood of Metallics. I guess at the time, around about 94-95, the American X-Men cartoon was playing, and I always considered the Brotherhood to be a nice mix between, you had the Sentinels with Master Mold, you had the Daleks, you had Terminator. I always felt that the Brotherhood of Metallics were a really great mix of all three of them. Each time they were on the page, they always felt like a real credible villain. I could always imagine just how terrifying each three of those would have been to meet kind of face to face in real life. And I think that the way that Rich Ellison drew them, Nigel Kitching wrote them, they always came across as a real kind of credible threat. And I was always really interested to see more of them.
This goes to Grimmer, the loyal slime ball of a grubby servant to Dr. Robotnik, and basically was as sadistic as a villain can get. Truly a gritty scum of a... Actually, what was Grimmer? A gremlin of sorts? I'm not even sure. But it would have been nice if this was actually addressed in the comics.
I would love to cheat and just say Robotnik here, but honestly I'm having a very hard time deciding between Chaos and Shadow. I loved Chaos, I thought he was a fantastic villain with a fantastic arc and a brilliant ending in the original comic, because he wasn't only defeated, he was humiliated, and I thought that was great. And one of my biggest pet peeves with Sonic the Comic Online is the fact that he was brought back. At the end of the print run he was implied to have been killed by the bigger fish, but in Sonic the Comic Online he was brought back, and I consider that to be a pretty big misstep considering his misdeeds. My other main favourite villain is Shadow, the Shadow 1. That is, I think he had a great arc, I think he had a brilliant beginning, middle, his introduction made 100 times more sense. He was cool, calm and collected, but also nihilistic. I think he had a very well defined personality, and the dichotomy between Sonic and Shadow was much, much better, because he wasn't just Sonic again as he was in the games. He had his own skills and abilities, and a much better backstory in my opinion.
With over 400 to choose from, Sonic the Comic has plenty of stories to like, but choosing a favourite from a large number like that is no mean feat. Which story or issue of STC stands tall for you?
So I thought for this I would talk about my favourite two-parter, which is Badnick's Bridge. Mostly because it's just so silly and over the top for a two-parter. There's a massive rocket, a massive bridge, Sonic blowing up said massive bridge, and then getting caught in a trooper's arm, which through the power of science turns into a cage and ends with Amy making that impossible shot. It's so great. I don't know. I think it's good because it starts off showing the gang in their current circumstances, in their circus disguises, and Amy nearly killing Walker in the process. And then it moves on to the problem, which is of course the bridge, and the Badniks transporting this massive rocket for the Death Egg, and Sonic going to stop them. It kind of ties in with the Sonic 3 Sonic and Knuckles adaptation, which later became developed into Doomsday. But at the same time, it's kind of contained within STC's universe. It's unique. Again, it has a few silly quips, and it has a hint at the whole Amy and Johnny thing, but that's the only time where it ever gets mentioned. There's a whole explosion of action, and then of course it ties directly into the next supermassive arc. So yeah, I think Badnick's Bridge is my favourite two-parter. It's the one which has stuck in my mind the most anyway. The other thing I'd like to comment on is the artwork by Casanovas. I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry. For me, I liked the way he drew the Sonic characters. They looked slightly taller than, say, Richard Elson's slightly stockier Sonic, but they didn't look stretched. Sometimes when I look at Sonic art these days, sometimes he looks a bit strange, like his head will be really big and his body will be quite long, and he'll have these ridiculously elongated legs, and me, as someone who grew up with the character, it sometimes looks a bit odd, whereas this work, Casanova's work, it just looks like ordinary 90s Sonic, but slightly taller, slightly older perhaps. I don't know, I've always quite liked it anyway. And the troopers sometimes have some very strange expressions. I think troopers were drawn differently pretty much by every artist in every strip, because it's quite a difficult design to draw. But also later on, when he draws Beware Predicto, he has a very strange set of expressions. So I think maybe that's probably just a symptom of the trooper design.
For me, the absolute greatest STC story of all time is issue 130's Showdown. The deck has never before or since been stacked more greatly against Sonic than in that story. In my opinion, a hero is only as good as the villains he defeats and the odds he overcomes. In Showdown, Sonic manages to outwit Robotnik by playing him at his own game. On top of that, the issue is full of gorgeous art and has loads of great cameos from enemies that starred in previous issues.
My favourite story that I ever kind of read in FCC, and I suppose it kind of links to my favourite game tie-in, was always the Sonic 3, Sonic and Knuckles kind of disaster storyline. The introduction of Knuckles was really cool. You got glimpses of the floating island, all the way through to Countdown, to Doomsday. It all felt so grand. It sounded so fantastic. The storyline was great. The artwork was fantastic. I really kind of consider that to be like the golden age of STC. And it kind of carried on all the way through to the Chaotix storyline. Again, it linked broadly into the return of the Chaotix, all the way through to issue 100. Everything flowed so smoothly. So I guess like, my favourite run of STC was all the way from the kind of issue 30s all the way to about issue 110.
Well, it's an obvious choice for me. It has to be the one that was featured in issue 131, I think it was. The one immediately after the three-parter where they seemed to defeat Robotnik, or so they thought. I could argue that that one was pretty good, but the one that immediately followed it had the heroes grouping together to wipe out the remainder of Robotnik's fleet of badniks, only to find that they were very severely overpowered by the remaining badniks and eventually defeated by them. The story went on and they ended up being captured by someone they didn't know who they were captured by until it was revealed to be Agent X towards the end. And massive sensational cliffhanger, one of my favourite cliffhangers of the time. He pulled back his hood and revealed himself to be in fact Johnny Lightfoot. And that was quite a big moment at the time, because I was sitting there thinking, he cannot have been a villain all this time, surely not. Unfortunately, I didn't actually read the second part, because that was about one of 2 issues I missed while I was collecting the comic, and I've never really got around to reading it. I should do, of course, because it was a brilliant first half. I get the odd feeling I'm going to be disappointed if I do, though, but nevertheless, the first half of that story was absolutely brilliant. One of my favourite moments.
My favourite story is for definite Revolution. It's just absolutely perfect to me. There is not a panel of that story that is not appealing in story, and there is not a panel of that story that's not appealing in art. It's fun, it's funny, it's action-packed, and I think it is a fantastic end to a fantastic villain.
There's Plasma, which is a great showcase for Amy's character, showing just how fun and well-rounded she was in her STC incarnation. Then we have Smokey and the Badnik, which is a fun little story with some unexpected character development for Sonic. Finally, there's The Big Decision, which feels like an epilogue piece to the Metallic storyline, showing the devastating effects such horrible events can have on someone, but again is a great exploration of Porker's character. And had it been his last appearance in the comic, it would have been a very satisfying send-off for him.
For this question in particular, I decided to choose a single complete written story, and my choice here is Smokey and the Badnik, printed back in issue 75. A nice short tale on how a childhood could be difficult due to how Morbius is run now in comparison to what it once was, where all the areas are now under close eye of Robotnik's troopers, and how Smokey's homeland is now a demolished and deteriorating city of sorts, and it's just turned into something of a barren wasteland. It also shows just how even in the eyes of one person, something that is usually considered a major threat or bad news to be around can actually be someone who just wants to adapt to a different means of life, away from what they were originally created for. In this case, Smokey's friendship with the Roller Badnik. I always enjoyed the nice touch on how the Roller in the end could always speak but never chose to because Smokey never asked. Silly in a way, but I always got a nice chuckle from it.
Favourite story? There's this whole string of just brilliant stories that were just circa issue 75 to 80. Like the Big Decision, which I've already mentioned, and Smoking the Badneck, Plasma, Voice of the People, Return to Miracle Planet, and of course Running Wild, which I think is a lot of people's favourite. That whole kind of really dark perspective on Supersonic, which kind of, I hadn't really taken much notice of the character before, but that really kind of opened my eyes of how kind of terrifying and exciting the whole concept was. I also loved The Evil Empire, which is just this brilliant idea of this all these grand political themes, really dark and dramatic writing. I love the whole concept of trial by combat. I mean, obviously not the first time that's ever been invented, but the application was brilliant. And of course, Knuckles Metallics. We've been waiting so long to see that, and it was great. And of course, the hilarious ending with the revelation of the Draken, and probably the best artwork in the entire series as well. I've got to say, by Richard Elson.
Sonic the Comic had many ongoing story arcs, some of which took years to play out. STC also had distinctive reinventions of the Sonic game storylines. So which story arc or game tie-in was your favourite?
My favourite story arc so far of all time has to be the Sonic and Knuckles one in Sonic the Comic. And it was just coming out at the time that I got the game for Christmas. And it was around the time I also got my very first issue of Sonic the Comic, so it was a massive bonus for me to play this game and also read the comic alongside it, and it was amazing.
Favourite story arc and or game tie-in? Again, this one was quite tricky because STC had so many great story arcs and tie-ins, or both. My first thought was to talk about the Doomsday arc, but I think I actually preferred the Sonic Terminator and Brotherhood of Metallics arc. I used to pronounce it as Metallics, but ever since the Birmingham meet I've known it's now Metallics. It makes so much more sense. But this arc developed so well over such a long period of time, and in so many different character strips as well. It also drew in so many different parts of the STC universe, such as the original Metallics kidnapping Amy, presumably causing her to action girl it up a bit in response. The Chaotix crew first appear because of the Brotherhood. Porker is dragged into the fight and a Metallics is made of him, and this causes him to break down and leave the Freedom Fighters. Robotnik is forced to work with Sonic and reveal the Metallics' weakness. There's time travel. The origins of Sonic and Robotnik's history are looked back on. It just manages to encompass the whole history of STC's Mobius into one arc without making it too complicated and without making it too screwy. For example, for the reader, a new reader picking up one of these stories without knowing the backstory, it isn't going to matter really. Each individual story is self-contained, but they all merge into one long story, and it just, it's good. Also, the idea of the Emperor Metallics. I think it's based on the Metal Sonic we see in Knuckles Chaotix, but the idea of him, his design is so cool, and he's kind of like sat there in a big evil robot, and it's such a great idea. And then there's also the pirate Omniviewer is created because of the Emperor. This later feeds into STCO, and it's a really, really great arc, and as an adaptation of originally Sonic CD and then Knuckles Chaotix, and great work STC. That was really good job.
The Brotherhood of Metallics is not only one of the longest running plot threads in STC, but also easily one of the best. The seeds were sown in the first year of the comic's life with the original Metallics, and when the Mark II Metallics shows up during the Sonic and Knuckles arc, even though he's defeated by the end of the story, you're left with a lingering question as to who the Brotherhood are. What really made them excellent villains was how hard it was for the heroes to defeat even one of them, and the fact they numbered in the hundreds or possibly even thousands means the deck had never been so stacked against Sonic and his friends. Considering even Robotnik was terrified of them, you always knew they were an extremely serious threat. The return of Chaotix is one of STC's finest moments, with a genius plot and one of the most shocking and exciting twists in STC, that due to a time loop, Sonic is responsible for the creation of Robotnik and all the evil Robotnik has ever done. All said, the Metallics were an enormous threat to Sonic and Knuckles for the first 3 years of the comic's life, and even after that point there have been multiple new Metallics that are every bit as deadly and dangerous as the previous models.
My favourite story arc for definite is the Syndicate saga. I think Ed did such an incredible job of that, because I actually have a lot more nostalgia for early Sonic the Comic Online than I think I do for a lot of STC, because a lot of STC to me I was just too young to really get. And I love the art and I love revisiting it and I think it's fantastic, but I think the fact that Ed was not only able to capture it but also advance it is incredible to me. I think Sonic's dialogue in the Syndicate saga is better than it has ever been anywhere else in Sonic the Comic.
Do we have to pick just one? Well, let me see. There's a whole Death Egg series tied into Sonic 3 and Knuckles. There were so many great ideas in that story arc that I wish had been used in the games proper. And it also has that awesome 2-page spread of the Death Egg's destruction and Sonic in freefall. I want that spread blown up and hung on my wall. I also really liked the Metallic storyline. I mean, Metal Sonic was a great villain, and I enjoyed just how far the story reached and the twists that the story took were well handled. In the end though, it just has to be the build-up to the final victory. Sonic's adventures in the Special Zone, the Knuckles World Tour, and the stories of the other Freedom Fighters, they were all great to read, with solid character development, and I loved how the stories tied into each other and built up to this massive finale. To my mind, it's Sonic the Comic's real moment of large-scale storytelling perfection.
Best story arc, I've got to say, Brotherhood of Metallics. The first big arc that wasn't tied in with the game, or if it was only loosely, which meant that nobody had any idea where it was all going. It came out every 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks, every single time, were absolute torture, because you just wanted to know what happened next. The issue where Sonic arrived in a dystopian nightmare world, it was just completely utterly mind-blowing. And the other one I single out is the last 10 issues, which just had this really exciting and really promising new direction of the comic. It felt like all the 4 strips of the comic being merged into one, kind of condensed into one really good one, and it was just really exciting, and all these crazy things were happening, and it was so disappointing when it ended. And of course that is why I felt it had to continue in some form.
This has to go to the Return of the Chaotix, which was printed throughout issues 67 up to 72. A mixture of what a good story can be played out during each issue with a variation of different events occurring. The story starts off with Sonic taking out a clone Metallics made to deceive Sonic into thinking that it was Porker Lewis, as Porker was trapped on the Miracle Planet at this point after the events of last appearing on the Miracle Planet to stop the Brotherhood of Metallics during issues 59 to 62. This leads on to having to travel back to beginnings in order to figure out how to stop the Metallics from altering the timeline and ruling over Robotnik and Morbius. This combines into a throwback to how Sonic became Blue, or how Dr. Kinterbor became Dr. Robotnik, as featured all the way back in issue 8. This then leads on to dealing with both Robotnik and the Metallics threat in order to end it all before the cliffhanger at the very end of issue 72, which Grimmer introduces new plans of a Knuckles variation of the Metallics. Because of this entire storyline, issue 71 in my eyes stands out as the pinnacle moment of this 6-parter, making it probably the best and most adored issue that I've simply ever put my eyes to. I give personal thanks to Nigel Kitching and Richard Elson along with Ellie DeVille for making this plotline work and illustrating the inspiration into creating this my personal favourite storyline from the original entire comic series.
STC has been home to the work of some amazingly talented artists over the years, with some of the comic's classic artists being direct influences on the current team. It might be a hard one to answer, but whose work were you always happiest to see on the page in STC?
My favourite artist for Sonic the Comic, of course, everyone's always going to say Richard Elson. Even today, I look back at his stuff and I see Sonic. I don't see anyone else. Even some of Sega's official drawings now, they really can't compare for me to Richard Elson. Now that I've been working on SDC more, I've been lucky enough to work with Nigel Dobbin, who's been really supportive of me over the last couple of years. I've spoken again to Richard Elson myself. He's been fantastic. Working with people like Adamus, who's really cartoony, very fast. He's consistently brilliant in everything that he does, and he's such a really genuinely nice guy. Working with Steve, he's got a really great grasp of action scenes, and even some of the older artists like John Howard, who drew the old Shinobi stories. I thought his stuff was really atmospheric, really kind of captured the theme of the Shinobi stories and the Shinobi games, even though I never really played them when I was a kid. I can still look back at them and think that they are fantastic bits of artwork, and I would really love to see some more of them in a full-length kind of graphic novel. I wish we really had more of that.
Richard Elson and John Howard are my favourite artists from Sonic the Comic ever so far. They were both very influential, and but I always admired their layout and style, and I still do. In Elson's case, he always had tight, clean artwork, and in Howard's case, I think he used a lot of marker art and stuff to a great effect, very, very ornamented. And the strips that he worked on, like namely Eternal Champions and Shinobi, really suited his style. And he was never called upon doing a Sonic strip that would have seriously diminished his style.
Richard Elson and Nigel Dobbin, but I also absolutely love Zach Simmons-Hearn. I think he is fantastic.
I'm going to go with the obvious this time. I think most STC fans will say this, but Richard Elson's work has always been my favourite in STC, and beyond. He's still a great artist. His work was the first I saw in issue 21, and as a fan it's kind of an honour to be able to see him improve and change his style over the years, how the comic developed, how his work developed, and to see him switch from the hand-drawn and coloured artwork to digital artwork. It's quite a major change in an artist's approach, I think. Although I no longer really buy comics these days, it's always nice to hear that his art is still doing well and is still getting an audience besides us crusty old STC fans. I actually met Richard Elson briefly along with a lot of other STC fans during the Birmingham meet in 2007, I think it was, and there were so many of us just kind of like hanging on his every word like, oh, it's Richard Elson, so I doubt he would remember, but for me this was like meeting one of my heroes, so yeah, awesome.
I don't think it comes to a surprise that Richard Elson would be on this list along with Nigel Dobbin, who probably would show up on everyone else's list as well. But there are 3 other artists who have enjoyed work from. The first one including Carl Flint, who worked on many side arc stories which usually involve Tails or Amy. Jose Casavanas, I hope I got that name right, who I really don't feel as though he's credited enough for his work. He has a nice, lush, vibrant aspect and does make each arena of each zone from the Sonic games just look so beautiful. And my final artist is Keith Page, especially for his work on the Sparkster series. Again, another interpretation of bringing a video game character into the comic series and adapting the ways and styles to it and adding their own little neat touches. Again, it was always great to see these artists doing their own thing and adapting to the actual storyline that they were given. I always enjoyed the stories that these guys always illustrated.
I quite like the work of Richard Elson. His was always quite nice to look at. I have to say one of my favourites, I'd not heard his name come up a lot, Roberto Corona. Especially his art on Supersonic story Return of the Nightmare was really, really nice. In general, it looks pretty awesome. From the modern day pool, Adami is one whose work I'm quite fond of. I have to admit, at first his work didn't really do anything for me, but over time I feel he's really come into his own as an artist. He has a really sort of cute art style which suits the more lighter and comedic stories that appear in STCO. His big strips especially, he really brings them to life. It'd be quite interesting to see him do a serious story. Though it doesn't really suit his style, it would be a challenge I might like to see if the chance ever arises some point in the future. Thalia is another whose work is absolutely astonishing. It's beautiful to look at. It's a shame she hasn't drawn anything for the comic in a while, but I'd like to see her back one day. I'd also like to give a shout out to Team Mobius as well. They made their debut, I think, with Sonic and Blaze strip, I think, a fair few issues back, and it looked absolutely brilliant, and I really hope to see more from them in the future.
Favourite artist, Nigel Dobbin. He did the most beautiful coloured artwork, really vivid stuff. I loved Bob Coroner's brilliant kind of cartoony style. I thought Carl Flynn did the best kind of really bold covers that really captured the eye, and that, obviously really important for a cover. I loved the humour edge of Nigel Kitching's stuff, but I think hands down king of SCC artists, Richard Elson. He was always a master of stylistic, imaginative and dynamic storytelling, and he's a hell of a lovely guy.
Richard Elson is my absolute favourite Sonic artist of all time. I don't think anyone has ever made the Blue Hedgehog look any better, though Tracy Yardley is an extremely close second. Nigel Dobbin's art was always gorgeous too. Roberto Corona is also incredibly important to the STC universe's look and helped shape many minor and background characters. John M. Burns was hands down the best colorist on the original comic. You could pair him with anyone and get an incredible and beautifully vibrant result. John Howard's art was always of a wonderfully high quality. As for STCO, there are so many wonderfully talented people involved. Rich Morgan is so well suited to the STC style. Talia Evans is probably my favourite of the STCO artists, though then again, Steve Spider-Man Davis is probably on a par with her. Saku and the rest of Team Mobius have constantly delivered gorgeous art. Adamis has to be praised for not only being consistently great, but also delivering such a huge bulk of high quality content. Pete Murphy, much like Burns on the original comic, can be paired with anyone else and deliver some absolutely gorgeous colours. Stiv's art has a wonderful charm to it. Mike Corker's hand-drawn stuff is almost always high quality.
Richard Elson's the obvious choice here. I loved how he portrayed the characters and the world around them, and it was his artwork that really got me paying attention to the artist, to the point where, for the first time, I started paying attention to the people creating the comic and be on the lookout for certain names. I also really like Nigel Dobbin's work, particularly on the Knuckles stories. His style adds a great sense of mysticism and introspection to the stories, which really suits the tone of the stories and Knuckles' character. As far as Sonic the Comic Online is concerned, Team Mobius' art is always a welcome sight, and Pete Murphy's art is getting better and better each time.
The artists of STC are undoubtedly talented, but without the writers there are no stories to draw. With 20 years of material to pick from, which writers do you regard the highest in STC's history?
Again, I'm not sure what to say here except Nigel Kitching, Lou Stringer and Ed Reynolds, who I just think did such an amazing job with Sonic's dialogue and making the plot and the universe more cohesive. I think that is such an incredible feat for an online comic to be doing, and I think he did it perfectly. I don't think he's without fault. I wasn't sure about the Moraine terrorism arc, and I am not sure again about Chaos coming back and just kind of sitting in a fish tank, because I don't think that's a big enough punishment for him. But I think Ed's good far outweighs his bad.
The two big names that you're really going to come across are Nigel Kitching and Lou Stringer. I really love both of these guys, but I think my leaning would be more towards Nigel Kitching. storylines were big and grand and fantastic, but still catered to younger kids. That I could get the jokes when I was little, I can look back at them now, and I can still find loads of enjoyment from them. When I look back at Lou Stringer's stuff, I can see how he was filled in to make some of the more lighter comics. I really felt like he was pigeonholed in this role. I look back at some of the stories like Brutus and Game Over. He really could write dramatic and sweeping storylines. I just felt like he was never really given the chance as a writer. For now, for STC Online, one of my new favourite writers has been Shane McDonald. His stuff with Knuckles and Skeletons in the Closet, it feels like classic STC. He really gets the characters and I think what the audience really want from the story. He delivers witty lines, he writes the characters in character, he leaves the readers with suspense and a bit of mystery. I think he's got the makings of a really great writer, and I really can't wait to work with him some more.
What a surprise, if it ain't Nigel Kitchen, who when we teamed up with Richard Elson could just create absolute great attributions to the comic. Mike Eales also falls into this category as well for his work on other Sega franchise stories, such as Wonder Boy and Golden Axe, along with the Zone Runner arc writings as well, which involve Tails. I can certainly see how difficult it must have been for these guys coming up with a new script each month, as all they really had to work on was a video game adaptation, but they themselves had to flesh out the characters and develop story plots in order to not only further enhance material for the comic in general, but make sure that readers came back ready for more good wholesome reading, which in many a case I truly believe the writing team could manage brilliantly. So my personal thanks goes out to anyone and everyone who ever worked on an STC, whether old or new, simply because you guys did try and make something worthwhile out of it. And for that, I once again thank you.
My favourite writer has to be Nigel Kitching. No other comment. I just particularly like his work on Captain Plunder and Decap Attack. So there's really no other commentary there, really, you know. Also, I did like his artwork as well.
Favourite writers, well, it's only really two writers we're talking about here. And while Lou Stringer brought an awful lot to the table and did tell some of the best stories, I've got to say, hands down, it was Nigel Kitching's baby, the whole thing. He brought so much, he pretty much created the whole mythos of STC. And he told the stories with an authentic style that's unlike pretty much anything else out there. It didn't talk down to children. It was written for an audience of him, basically, and we just enjoyed the ride along with it.
Nigel Kitchen was also my favourite writer. I mean, his interpretation of all the characters, Sonic, Tails, Robotnik, Amy, are all very different from the usual treatment that these characters normally get in Sega's work, in Archie, and all of the media they've appeared in, really. His decision to write Sonic as this flawed hero, like, he is the hero, but he's not exactly a great person, he's not a very good role model, really. But he doesn't have so many personal issues that it gets in the way of the story. Like, it doesn't really get in the way of things that he has to do. So, yeah. And in some ways, like, Nigel Kitchen's Sonic is the Sonic that I know. It's the story. It's the one. It's the version that's defined Sonic as a character for me for a very long time. And in some ways, since I've been getting back in the games recently, it's actually been kind of hard to get used to the chirpy Sonic again. So, yeah, Nigel Kitchen's writing has had a massive impact on the way I see the character.
It has to be Nigel Kitching. I just love how well-rounded his style of writing is, and just how successfully his stories merged action, drama, humour, and character development. He took the concept seriously, but not too seriously, getting just the right balance and just making stories that were fun and entertaining to read. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of Lou Stringer's work I really like, but I just find Kitschy's work to be the most consistently good, if you know what I mean. As for STCO, I've become a massive fan of Shay's work. He really seems to get the STCO tone and the characters in this universe.
I think it's safe to say that two names will dominate this particular category. Nigel Kitching and Lou Stringer are obviously the two most important writers in STC's history, but both in different ways. Nigel was usually responsible for driving forward the larger plot of the comic, and is responsible for much of the characterization readers came to recognise as the STC versions of these characters, but Lou is probably more responsible for the fleshing out of the world of Mobius. Lou created dozens of zones and characters over the years, many of whom have truly earned their place in the Sonic pantheon. Both men are generally seen as two sides of the same coin, which is noticeable in the stories where they collaborated, The Final Victory and Showdown. Lou Stringer is a tenured name on many British humour comics, and so a lot of his strips contain puns and gags, whereas Nigel's work is often seen as more serious in nature, as he was often behind the various status quos the comic had over the years setting up major threats. However, it does both men a disservice to not recognise the fact they were both equally talented in comedic and dramatic writing. Lou's final arc on the series, known variously as Planet Imperil or Game Over, is one of the comic's most dark and serious stories, and his Commander Brutus plotline is brilliant and very much a serious plotline in order to keep Brutus as serious a threat as possible. Conversely, Nigel wrote many hilarious comedic moments over the years and was vital in shaping Sonic's warped sense of humour, which has informed the writing of the character ever since. Both men made the comic what it is, light-hearted enough for younger readers to appreciate, but with just enough edge to keep it interesting for older readers and to consistently warrant a reread. Both men have had a huge influence on my writing style. As for STC Online, the plotting and scripting of Ed Reynolds managed to breathe new life into the comic and also bring it back in a form that was recognisably STC. Of the current lineup, my favourite writer is definitely Shamie McDonald. So few writers have managed to completely nail the characterization of everyone they've written for STCO so immediately as Shay. Not only has he done wonderful work so far, but he's also left me incredibly excited for what he's yet to bring to the table. And on top of that, his cliffhangers are some of the best STC has ever seen.
To be honest with you, I can't remember who wrote particular stories in most instances, but there's one particular writer from the very recent story arc, Shamie, who, let's just say he's really got the whole ethos of STC, the whole essence of it, right down to a T. He really understands how to write a comic strip, not just in regards to STC, but a general sort of classic action comic strip. He's generally got it sussed, and every one of his stories so far has been very enjoyable to read, and I really hope to see more from him in the future.
Sonic the Comic had loads of great action-packed stories, but it also had a huge helping of comedy. From giggles to belly laughs, which moment or story in STC do you remember as the funniest of all time?
Funniest moment's got to be Simpsons' escape from prison in issue number 49, done in a very cartoonish, hilarious Tex Avery style fashion. And of course Filch and Captain Plunder's crew trying to break straight back in, and most of them getting stuck.
I can't say I remember many moments from the comic that were particularly laugh-out-loud funny, but I seem to remember that some of the writers seem to have an affinity for puns, especially in regards to punny names. In fact, I've got one particular strip which I've managed to dig out right here, called Taking the Plunge. It's from, I can't remember the original issue, this is from Total Sonic, and there's the characters in this, all sort of minor one-shot characters that gang up on Sonic, these sort of sea creature thingies, and they all have names such as Shaka Khan, Eelton John, Jaws Michael, Crabsea Nesbit, and all sorts of things like that. Oh yes, and Trouty, which isn't particularly funny. Someone will have to explain that one to me. So that was quite amusing when I first read that. Besides that, I quite enjoy the comedy in Adami's strips, especially a recent big one where he's delivering the pizza. That was quite amusing.
I'll try and keep this brief, because there are quite a few, and I don't want to list every single one. First of all, the Fundamental Four being turned into a pot by Charmy and his hive mates. That was so stupid. It's so funny. Nuts and Bolt as well was a pretty funny villain. I mean, he was kind of terrifying, especially in his second form, the ice form. That was a bit creepy. But he goes absolutely berserk over the S word. He said the S word. And the funny thing is, you never actually see him fight Sonic. He only fights Tails and the Flock. And that made me giggle. And the fact that his cronies had amusing puns for names like Sulfuric and Test Tube. It's, silly little things like that I find funny. Another funny moment, a constantly funny moment pretty much, is Shorty reminding people of his origin story in any of his appearances. It's amusing if you're a regular reader because you're looking at it thinking, yes, I know, but how could you not know who Shortfuse the Cybernick is? But to a new reader, it's just explaining who he is, because he is a very unique character to SDC, and I imagine a new reader picking it up and seeing this guy, this metal squirrel guy, thinking, who is this? So, yeah, I can see why it was done, but it's still pretty funny. And finally, Amy hitting Knuckles over the head with a crowbar. I mean, is that a deliberate Half-Life reference? I kind of hope so in a way, but... and I think the response is, if a friend can't hit you over the head with a crowbar, who can? That's one of the things why I like Amy in SDC. She doesn't think silly like that. She knows that Knuckles is going to be fine because he has a skull so dense that Robotnik could put a chip in it and he wouldn't notice much earlier on. It was necessary, it needed doing, but at the same time it's kind of funny.
In terms of one of my favourite, funniest Sonic the Comic storylines was Big the Cat one that we ran recently. Big's Day Out was such a hilariously funny story. Adamus had really great artwork. I was really, really enthusiastic to work on that myself, just on the colours. But even Shay's script was so well written. It even wrote in some of the panel beats, if you know what I mean. There's this one scene where Big arrives at this house to deliver this guy's pizza, and he just says, "Hi, pizza delivery," and Big just stares at him. For a good kind of 10 seconds you could leave it, and the joke just builds and builds, and then all of a sudden he realises he doesn't even have the pizza in his hands as the pizza goes flying past in the background. It's so funny. There are these just beats in the comic, and it works so well. The comedy is there on the page, and it translated so well from the script all the way to the artwork.
My funniest moment or story. This goes to the result of the Crimson Cobra's defeat by having his home repossessed and then completely taken over by Charmy Bee in issue 154. Crimson believes that he has defeated the Chaotix after turning them all insane with his brain scambler weapon. But due to Charmy being slightly mental to begin with, and having wealth thanks to being the son of the Royal Bee family, Charmy decides to buy the company from under Crimson and just render him useless by taking all of his possessions. It was just an interesting twist to the usual defeat enemy within battle method that everyone just seems to write out. It's just like a very substandard thing. But this swerve in a sense just came out of nowhere, and it was quite interesting to see how the writer behind the comic actually tried to change it up, which was really nice to see.
Well, either of the two Chaotix stories would qualify here, mostly because of just how out of control they were. And I felt the endings were absolutely hilarious. Utterly absurd, yet perfectly in keeping with the stories and characters. I also liked some of the more subtle moments of banter between the characters, like Johnny and Porker taking the mick out of Amy because she didn't believe the floating island existed. Little moments like that really helped to lighten the tone of the comic and keep it as well-rounded as possible, and keeping it entertaining to read all the way through.
In Captain Plunder's first solo strip, he's captured due to the incompetence of his crew and thrown in prison. He eventually makes his escape with the help of Simpson the Cat, a walking, talking cartoon character in STC's world. At one point during the escape, Plunder and Simpson need a source of light, and Simpson has an idea, which, as a toon, represents itself as a light bulb above the head, which the two use to light the way. Upon hearing voices, actually his own crew, come to rescue him, Plunder orders Simpson to turn out the light. The next sequence is almost entirely without dialogue or sound effects, and all the laughs come from what's drawn on the page as Simpson tries desperately to turn the light off. When I saw this sequence for the first time, I laughed so hard for so long, I had to put the comic down and come back to it. STC has had loads of funny moments, but this one stands out as the one that hurt my gut the most with laughter. While the original video game it's based on is an obscure and often overlooked title, Decap Attack holds a special place in the hearts of many STC readers as the most successful and longest running Sega Superstars comic strip. While Decap Attack has lots of moments of slapstick humour, it also has a wealth of amusing parody and self-referential comedy within its pages. But which Decap Attack strip do you most fondly remember?
The funniest STC moment for me is the same as my favourite Decap Attack moment. It is the montage from Decap Man, where he fights against a series of zany supervillains such as Monty the Python and Reverse Psychology Man, which makes me smile just thinking about it.
Favourite Decap Attack story or moments? Oh, so many to choose. One that gets me chuckling every time though is how the strip The Fearless Monster Hunters ended. Not only was the strip itself really funny, but I love the ending punchline when it's revealed what the Mountain Banshee actually is. I like how the joke's foreshadowed earlier in the comic, plus it's just really funny for me to picture Frankenstein yodeling, at least in what I picture his voice sounding like. Every time I mentally picture it, I end up getting a massive fit of the giggles. Just goes to show how simple things please simple minds, I suppose.
Again, this was quite hard because I remember finding the whole strip quite funny. I mean, the whole point of the strip was that it was funny, so it was quite hard. But the issues that the stories that always got me the most were when the Decap Attack gang first arrive in Hell. And they find the toilets don't work, and there's also a Milton Keynes joke in there somewhere, and I just remember laughing my ass off at the professor saying, "I really have to go to the loo," and the response being, "It's hell, mate, they're all out of order." It's just so wacky, so ridiculous. And actually, the Decap Attack strips were the only STC strip that I could take to school, and the other pupils would enjoy it and laugh at it, and you know, this silly guy with green hair and this mummy guy, and nobody really knew what it was, but yeah, they seemed enthused by it. And to be honest, I was the only person in my school that really collected STC and was enthusiastic about it, so it was kind of nice to have my friends enjoy a strip with me.
I did enjoy reading Decap Attack, and my favourite moment is probably the birth of a Blockbusters contestant in issue 14, before it was actually truly revealed in issue 15. This follows on the story arc based upon the game. The aftermath once Max Decap makes a run for it to get away from this creation of a Blockbusters contestant. After trying to hunt him down to play the Gold Run, this was a final game moment in the Blockbusters series. It was a nice throwback continuation as we see him locked away in the dungeon from time to time throughout the other stories that involve Decap Attack and all the other characters within that series. Some examples include Who Killed Chuck and Sonic the Comics Online Good Luck Chuck, where he is seen still trying to guess Igor's question of what day is the age and place of imprisonment and torture.
Favourite Decap story? So many to choose from. I mean, I love that whole bit of the detective's brain being mangled. It's just completely and utterly inappropriate for a children's comic, but it's brutally brilliant. I loved, I think probably my favourite story would have to be Mr. Cuddle Bunny, Legend of Mr. Cuddle Bunny. It was just probably the most off-the-wall thing that was ever seen in STC, and that includes Pirate STC. It was just mad and hilarious and very funny. And I suppose I can't fail to mention one of the seminal moments in my life, which was finding out that the Decap Attack script that I've written, one of the pages has been drawn by Nigel Kitching, and it looked absolutely beautiful. And I cannot forget how astonished I was to see that.
Just about every Decap Attack strip was a classic, though the first two are probably the funniest things STC has ever run. Almost every single panel holds a gag of some variety. Nigel Kitching's art brought the characters to life in a cartoony and highly pleasing aesthetic, and his writing helped transform the cast from minor video game characters to full-fledged Sega superstars. STC would not have been the same without a Decap Attack, and I and many other readers are very grateful Nigel was given the opportunity to run with the characters for so long.
Back with classic STC, one of the funniest stories I read was Who Killed Chuck D-Head. It was probably the first Decap story I read. I'd missed the first one, I was too young at the time. But now I look back at it and it's really quite risque. The artwork is dark, it's kind of gloomy, but there's so much attention to detail. The story is quite gruesome and vulgar, but it really kind of ties into like the boy mentality of like a 12-year-old. I look back at it and I still kind of ream with laughter. It's so funny, so well written. One of the funniest ones I have recently come back to is the one with Chuck and the Debt Collectors, where Chuck has to take out a loan which he must pay back within the first 24 hours or something similar. And one of the hired goons just decides to beat him up for not paying it, and if he doesn't pay it within so much time, he has to forfeit all his arms and legs and organs and do experimental drugs and things on him. And to a kid that really doesn't sound all that funny, or it does and it doesn't to a degree, but when Chuck seems to agree with it and then ends up signing Eagle's name, I was howling with laughter even as a kid. Something like Bank Collectors, it's not funny, but Nigel Kitchen just really seemed to get it. I love it to pieces, and it's one that I can still go back to, and I kind of wish Debt Collectors were like that in real life. Maybe not.
There was more to STC than simply Sonic and Decap Attack, of course. The comic was host to a variety of Sega superstars, from Shinobi to Wonder Boy, from Kid Chameleon to the heroes of The Legend of Golden Axe. STC's Sega Superstars stories were incredibly varied in both their approach to the source material and in their delivery. Which one of these stories do you like the most?
It was that long ago that they were in the original STC that I really struggle to remember any of them offhand. I vaguely remember the Echo the Dolphin ones, but they seemed a bit strange at the time. I didn't really get them. I was only little. More recently in STCO, I really enjoyed the Rice Star strip that Stiv did. That was quite funny. Particularly some of the... there's one particular panel which looked a little bit... how would I put it? It claims they were dancing. Anyway, I'll leave that up to you to decide if you ever read it. I also enjoyed the House of the Dead strip that was done in a way. It didn't really fit the whole theme of Sonic the comic in general, really. In fact, it didn't fit it at all, but standing on its own, felt like there was bits skipped out now that I come to think of it, but you know, it was very limited space that the writer had to work with, but they just about managed to pull it off. As a standalone story, I quite enjoyed it, even though it didn't really fit the whole essence of STCO all that well. But it was very nice.
I think one of my favourite non-Sonic storylines, it's either got to be, you know, the Decap Attack stories, but probably the one that stuck with me more was the Fear Pavilion storyline that was run with Shinobi. The story saw Joe Masashi working his way down a pagoda, and on each level you had a different adversary that you had to fight to get to the woman that he loved, who was supposedly down at the bottom, because he worked his way from the top to the bottom. And each story of the script had Joe fight a different person on a different floor, and each storyline seemed to be so different. The artwork was fantastic, it was really bright and beautiful, it was really vibrant. Joe had great action scenes, the villains on each floor were memorable. I can remember the old man swearing in Chinese, you've got the Monkey King on one of the floors, you've got the guy on really high stilts that just had the height advantage over Joe. It was really great and gripping stuff, and again, I really would have liked to have seen something like that expanded into a big kind of graphic novel, or even a series of graphic novels. I think they were really great.
Favourite Sega Superstars story or moment? Well, I don't really have a lot to say here, as I didn't really read the comic for anything outside of the Sonic-related stories and Decap Attack. I do remember really being into the Eternal Champions back in the day, though, simply because it seemed like such an awesome concept, considering I was heavily obsessed with time travel at the time. I even went so far as to buy the Eternal Champions special that Fleetway released. I don't know if that has any bearing on what I thought of the actual quality of the strips, but I just really liked the concept of the character designs.
I do remember enjoying the Echo stories quite a lot. The art was nice in the second strip. I remember the first strip, it was a bit garish. But it features quite a lot of the game's features, such as the glyphs, the asterite. There's even a massive octopus protecting the Black Pearl. And I seem to remember that the dialogue also tried to emulate that of the Echo games, such as calling sharks rip teeth. Water pressures called heavy water and things like that. So yeah, it was quite a nice adaptation. And then the vortex creatures. I know that they kind of sort of do in the games, but even more so in SGC, they look like xenomorphs, which is amusing. Their language was represented as like funny little squiggles and symbols. So to me, it looked like that they were swearing a lot as well. But yeah, I like those guys. They were almost comical. I seem to remember the only vortex you see are two of them going to pick up Echo after he's been stranded, and yeah, they're almost bickering. Yeah. I remember that the end of Echo was a little bit abrupt, actually. He returns to Earth after the vortex are defeated, and then the asteroid just kind of buggers off home. Sorry, I just swore. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see where it could possibly pick up again, should STCO continue Echo.
There are loads of Sega Superstar stories, but not all of them are memorable. For me, the two that stand above the rest, aside from Decapitac obviously, are Kid Chameleon and Marco's Magic Football. Both take elements from the source material, but flesh them out hugely. Marco's Magic Football in particular is of an extremely high quality because of how funny it was. Lou Stringer took a game that was already reliant on a healthy amount of nonsense and managed to make it even sillier. The strip felt like it could have easily belonged in the Beano or Dandy. The ironic thing being then that what's probably my pick of the bunch for the Sega Superstar strips isn't even based on a video game made by Sega, as the game was created by Domark.
None of the Sega strips really struck much of a chord with me, apart from Decapitac. I think Streets of Rage had just brilliantly brash artwork that it was kind of apart from the game, and it really kind of suited the idea. And I like the arc in Echo as well. It was kind of Steve White stuff was just really nice to look at. And Pirate SCC had really good artwork, although the story made absolutely no sense to me.
My favourite Sega Superstar story or moment. This comes from Sonic the Comics issue 55 in Sparkster, Last of the Rocket Knights Part 3 arc. King Jadal introduces his mother to Princess Shelley, which results in her believing that Shelley is on the menu for dinner as opposed to Jadal just wanting to simply marry her. Some well-written banter between Jadal and his mother portrayed here, along with one panel showing Princess Shelley's servants complimenting on how she just looks exactly like a princess, only for Shelley to actually reply back with, "I am a princess, you idiot." Yet more wholesome goodness from Nigel Kitchen's story writing talents on display here.
Lastly, do you have any other fond memories of Sonic the Comic from the last 20 years?
I got artwork printed in Sonic the Comic when I was 12 years old. When I was 16 years old. And these are a couple of stories. The first one is I sent off my artwork to Sonic the Comic as a 12-year-old, and they printed a picture of mine called Tikna the Tiknonik, which was of Tikna wearing her own Cybernik style costume. And I did not get the enamel badge that was promised for the letter section that time. But 4 years later, I got this Sonic watch in the post with a little letter saying that, oh, well done on getting your work printed in Sonic the Comic. And I was like, what? So I went out and got the most recent issue of Sonic the Comic, and I found out that they'd used my artwork that I'd sent in years before and must have found it somewhere and reprinted it. So yeah, that was a nice little bonus.
Sonic the Comic was an enormous part of my childhood. Every fortnight I eagerly awaited the new issue, wondering what action was in store for us readers. It's safe to say STC's version of the Sonic characters is more responsible than anything else for helping keep me a part of the fandom even to this day. I'm proud to say I own a canvas print of a Decapitite picture Nigel Kitching did out of the goodness of his heart when I asked if he'd like to draw the characters again many years ago. I also own the first page of the first part of Mutant League. One of my greatest moments as a Sonic fan was attending the 2012 Summer of Sonic fan convention. Not only did I get to meet many of the STC creators up close and in person, but I was also fortunate enough to win Richard Elson's original pencil artwork for the cover of issue 256, which is the centerpiece of my STC collection. To actually own a part of STC is such a privilege for me, and I'll always treasure the amazing piece of art.
Other fond memories. This has to go to discovering that STC was being continued online for a new and old viewers to witness and read. It's great to see that something so well loved by others can still draw in a crowd for fans and still be able to actually promote some good stories along with bringing back old favourites from other games such as Decap Attack, or even introducing newer stories based around older game franchises such as Rystar. So my many thanks goes out to the newer group of artists and writers who makes this continuation possible.
One last fond memory I have of STC was one instance where I was reading Speedlines, and this was a few days after I'd finished having a lend of somebody's copy, a cousin's copy of Sonic 3 on the Mega Drive. I'd been looking for it for years, never played it before, finally got the chance to play it, and of course I was sitting there on my first day playing all the way through it, and got all the way to Act 2 of Carnival Night Zone. I think I know what's coming next. A certain red and white drum hampered my progress slightly, and a few days after I gave it back, I got me latest issue of STC, and there it was in Speedlines, bold as brass. Somebody had written in asking about that particular drum and how to get past it, and the brilliant and beautiful Megadroid very kindly provided the answer. For me, unfortunately, it came just a few days too late, but nevertheless I retained Megadroid's answer in my memory for many years, over 4 of them in fact, until I got Sonic Mega Collection on the GameCube, at which point I got to that very same part in the game, remembered Megadroid's sage advice, and flew through it without any further bother. So for that I would like to thank Megadroid and the team very much.
Other fond memories, I could go on about all the stuff in the actual comic I missed, but I remember first discovering the existence of Sonic the Comic online. It was a revelatory moment for me to just think that fans could continue the comic in such a quality manner, with the endorsement of most of the original creators no less. Also, meeting the two Nigels and Richard Elson for the first time. It's amazing to think how much I respected, even idolised those guys in my childhood without realising it. Also seeing the two Nigels on the stage with Ian Flynn and Tracy Yardley from the Archie comics. Now I really want all 4 of them to collaborate on a Sonic storyline at some point.
Other really fond memories are, of course, working on it. I have had my ups and downs, and I have had my problems with some of the stories, as I'm sure a quick trip to the message room will tell you, but I do not withhold a single ounce of love for this project, because Sonic the Comic is inherently precious to me because it was the first universe I was ever really invested in of my own volition. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that without Sonic the Comic I wouldn't be where I am today, doing what I love, which is writing and drawing, but I do think it played a crucial part in a lot of my tastes.
And that, I think, is pretty much it for me in terms of STC. I guess some of the happiest memories I've ever had from Sonic the Comic have been a little bit more recent, more than anything. I've been lucky enough really to kind of speak to some of the classic artists like Nigel Dobbin and Rich Elson and Nigel Kitching over the last couple of years at Summer of Sonic. I've worked with them behind the scenes, I've spoken to them, I've been able to buy some of the original pages, I've got them framed, and I treasure them, and I will treasure them forever. I've met some great new friends, people that I can see myself being friends with for the rest of my life, that I met through Sonic the Comic. You know, there was this blue hedgehog on a comic that brought us all together. And here I am sitting here at 10:30 at night talking about this, and I'm so enthusiastic about it. I love it to bits. I will continue to support it for as long as it will keep going, and even further beyond. I would encourage anyone to pick up some of the classic Sonic the Comic stories. If they'll have me, I would still really like to carry on working for Sonic the Comic. I'm working on quite a few different projects for the comic for the 20th anniversary coming up. We've got some really cool projects. I think people are really going to be pleased. I hope a lot of people really kind of get into it, send us artwork in. I want to see what other people are doing. You know, this is a year that Sonic the Comic, it turns 20. It's a big occasion. We've got the Tumblr, we've got the Twitter, there's the Facebook. Even get involved on the message boards, send stuff into the graphic zone. We will post it. I really can't wait to see more from all over the Sonic the Comic community, and just to introduce it more to the wider Sonic community in general. I really can't wait, and I'd love to hear what other people have got to say as well.
Other fun memories. ST Online is it's just such a big one. In many ways it's amazing. It's still going on 10 years later. In fact, 13 years for those of us who actually worked on it from the start. That's actually, obviously that's even longer than the original comic went on, because that was only 8 years, and only 6 of them were producing new material, 6 or 7. So yeah, I mean, I've made so many lovely friends from that as well. It's just been wonderful to see it's still going, really. I loved writing the stories I wrote as well. They're just the whole universe is just so much fun to sort of pick out kind of new corners of, and but also just seeing, kind of finding new edges to what's already there. I loved doing the research for Cedric. That was doing the research was basically most of the writing, but it just gave me this wonderful opportunity to just reread all these wonderful stories from long ago, and just picking out the best kind of moments that could kind of interweave with the story I was trying to tell. On the same token, seeing the artwork come in for something I've written, especially when it's someone like Adamus, who just does the most, he did the most breathtaking pages for the Cream story I did last year. I was actually standing in the incredible Westminster Hall in London, which is just this beautiful, massive hall. And my eyes were just fixated on this tiny phone where one of Adamus' best pages of the Cream story, the one where she's screaming, which is my favourite page. He just finished painting that, and he emailed it to me, and it was just so gorgeous that I couldn't think about anything else. Other memories? Age 17, sat around a pub table with my friends Dave and Abby, of course, who drew the first issue of ST Online, Selena, and Nigel Kitching and Richard Elson, and we just talked about STC for a couple of hours, and it was great. And I learned so much, and we just had such a lovely time. And of course, as alluded to earlier on, UKCAC 95, which happened to fall on my 11th birthday, and I got to meet everyone involved in STC for the first time, and it was just it's probably the best birthday ever, and that's where I'm going to leave you. Thank you for listening.
Other than the original enjoyment of the comic in the first place, I guess when I found out about STCO, I was really, really happy, because I'd not forgotten about the comic, but I'd put it behind me, as it were, for a long time. I stopped reading the comic when I was maybe 13, 14. And I guess as soon as I found out somebody had made not a remake, but a unofficial continuation of it, I was just really happy to see that there were fans out there besides me, because I was pretty much the only fan. My sister a little bit as well, but nobody I knew growing up read this comic, enjoyed this comic. Hell, I don't think I knew anyone that even liked Sonic. I mean, I was the only one, pretty much. So, yeah, I'd say my fondest memory is finding out about SDCO, finding the other members of the forum, the people that make the comic, and then to eventually meeting a lot of them, a lot of you guys in Birmingham back in 2007. That was fantastic that day. I mean, I couldn't stay for all of it, but it was just great to see other fans, talk to them, get to know some of them, and then we all turned up to see, Nigel Kitching talking about something completely different. We were all there with our comics going yay, and that must have been pretty horrible for Nigel, but for us it was like, it was like meeting a hero. And then to go upstairs to that extra balcony bit and talk to the two Nigels and to Richard Elson, that was really, they didn't need to do that. They didn't need to acknowledge us as their fans like that, and they did, and it was just so fantastic. That was really great. My claim to sort of fame would be that one of my pictures was printed in a late issue of STC. Post 100 is what I mean by late. Actually, I think it was printed several years after I initially sent it in. Embarrassingly, though, it was Amy dressed as a yellow Power Ranger, and it was featured in the STC's Zany Amy Graphic Zone feature, which was unique. I have no idea why I drew Amy as a Power Ranger. I mean, I was a kid, I had all kinds of crazy ideas and influences and all kinds of other stuff. But another embarrassing thing is that now, when I look at the picture, I realise that I accidentally drew 6 digits on one of Amy's hands, which is quite funny, and I can't believe that actually got into the print. But the cool part was that sometime after it was printed, I got some fan mail that the editor had sent on to me. Another reader of the comic sent me a letter that said something along the lines of, power to a drawing, or something 90s cheesy like that. But it was very sweet, and I was really chuffed. I don't actually have the letter anymore, but if it was somebody on the forum who sent it, I was very happy to get that letter, so thank you. In addition to this, my mum had a habit of joining in with my terrible fan pictures and stuff like that. So for STC, she wrote a terrible poem, sorry Mum, for Megadroid, and I drew some pictures, and we added onto it, and then we posted it to the comic. It was something along the lines of a little 9-10-year-old me asking the Humes if I could get their tea, and could I be their apprentice at drawing and stuff like that. So, it didn't get printed. At least I hope it didn't. But I did get a letter from Megadroid saying, this is really cool, don't stop writing poems, yeah. And I got an STC badge, which of course I wore everywhere. Don't know what happened to it since. But that's my claim to STC fame. My picture was printed, and I got a fan. I didn't get a cup, though.
Sonic the Comic has been a massive part in the lives of thousands of Sonic fans across the globe. Here's hoping it continues to be one for years to come. Happy 20th birthday, Sonic the Comic! You've been listening to Speed Reading, 20 Years of Sonic the Comic. I've been your narrator, producer, and editor, LT Fletcher. Contributions were from Badly Drawn Manchild, Chris Beath Gargett, Leanne Hamilton, Claire Ryan, Pete Murphy, Shamie McDonald, the SSGD Theory, and myself. You can follow Sonic the Comic on various social media outlets. Facebook.com/Sonic the Comic, Twitter @Megadroid_STC, and Tumblr @stconline.tumblr.com. And don't forget to check out stconline.co.uk for the latest issue. You can find Sonic the Podcast at sonicthepodcast.libsyn.com or via iTunes. Special thanks go to all Sonic the Comic contributors past and present. Without you guys, none of this would have been possible. Fleetway, now Egmont, for bringing us Sonic the Comic in the first place. You inspired a generation of Sonic fans. And Sega, for creating Sonic the Hedgehog. It's been a wild ride. Here's hoping it never ends. Look for the special extended edition of this feature with video coming soon.